Presiding Officer, it is with great pleasure that I stand before the House to support the motion, which is critical for the development of Tobago and the movement of Tobago to a place where we control our own destiny. As I sat and listened to the minority leader, I could not help but think that the majority of his presentation came from a place and from a mind that was still suffering the effects of colonialism. Colonialism is still defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It still represents one nation subjugating another nation, conquering, in this case, the minds of the population and exploiting it. And even today, while we sit here, it is still sometimes pursued in a subtle and insidious way, and at other times in a flagrant and blatant, disrespectful manner, using economic, political, and legal pressures or socio-cultural and other pressures. Whatever the motive, colonialism is still intended to achieve the same purpose, just as it did 250 years ago, a purpose of economic exploitation of a colony's natural resources, creation of new markets for the colonizers, and worst of all, the imposition and or extension of the colonizers' authority over life beyond their own borders. And that is what I got from the presentation by the minority leader, because the judgment he quoted that seemed to be the basis for his presentation is not at all related to what we are attempting to do and what we will do today. The judgment he quoted is as a judgment based on a case that the THA then went to court to attempt to question the policy-making authority of what we call the central government. This motion does not seek to do that. So I rise and I stand exultantly in support of this motion that seeks substantively to end the colonizers' authority over life and livelihood in Tobago in the critical area of development planning and control. Madam Presiding Officer, the existing post-colonial planning structure is slow poisoning our development systems. Hence, this institutional structure needs to be excised, not in a slow and incremental manner, but by emergency surgery. Therefore, retrieving the authority over town and country planning into the sphere of control of the government of Tobago is a necessary and timely step in support of our march towards inevitable self-determination. And no ill-conceived judgment will change that. Madam Presiding Officer, if we are to understand the slowness, the stymieing, and the blocking of approvals that has been masqueraded as town and country planning for so many years with impunity, we need to understand how the legal and institutional structure came to be. But more than that, we need to understand the intent behind the structure in the first place. That intent was clearly demonstrated today by the minority leader. So it is within this historical context I wish to place my presentation. Madam Presiding Officer, it is my intention to demonstrate that our current challenges regarding planning and development in Tobago find their origin in the governance arrangement that has been adversative to the social, cultural, and economic development of the people of Tobago. We need to appreciate that land is the basis of all social organization, and therefore the development of and the control over it, its use, remain one of the most fundamental responsibilities of any government. However, it will be irresponsible of me if I did not present in this House for the public record a brief history of the emergence of planning in Tobago, from colonial government to the current town and country planning legislation. I think this is important, Madam Presiding Officer, because as policymakers, if we do not understand the historical context and the history of our condition and the role that government plays in the solution, we are likely, like the minority leader, to resist policies that are intended to contribute to our progress as a people. In 1814, Tobago was confirmed as a British colony by the Paris Treaty. Tobago remained a separate colony until 1888, after which it was annexed to Trinidad in 1889. Planning then was greatly influenced by the dominant British planning policies of this area. These policies were aimed, similar to as they do now between Tobago and Trinidad, primarily at securing British economy from overseas and the livelihood of its citizens in the colonies. Madam Presiding Officer, in 1938, the Trinidad and Tobago Town and Country Regional Planning Ordinance was the first of many town planning ordinances to be introduced in the British colonies. In 1938, the ordinance was based on the English Town and Country Planning Act of 1932. We know that the 1938 ordinance was in fact a Trinidad ordinance, and it became applicable to Tobago because on the 20th of October 1898, by order in council, Tobago was made a ward of Trinidad and Tobago, and according to section 3 of that order, and I quote, "The laws of Trinidad enforced on the date of the coming into force of this order shall be enforced in Tobago, and the laws theretofore enforced in Tobago shall, as far as they differ from the law enforced in Trinidad, shall thereupon cease to be enforced." This quotation continues to be in play today by those who run the parliament in Trinidad. And what we are seeking to do is to take back one thing that is rightfully ours. Madam Presiding Officer, in 1945, the County Council Act was enacted in the colonial Trinidad Parliament. Again, Tobago's ideals were subsumed
Members, you are required to have your cell phones either on silent or turned off. Thank you.
Madam Presiding Officer, in 1945, The County Council Act was enacted in the colonial Trinidad Parliament. And once again, Tobago's ideals were subsumed within the local government structure. As it seems, even today, that it matters not that Tobago kept its first election 180 years before Trinidad, but having exchanged imperial colonialism for Trinidad colonialism, Allah, the father of Trinidad, the ethos for urban and regional planning have been vested elsewhere for too long and not in our favor. Since the 1960s, Madam Presiding Officer, the development of land in Tobago has been governed within the legislative framework provided by the Town and Country Planning Act, Chapter 3501 of the Laws of Trinidad and Tobago, and its subsidiary regulations. Our current system of town and country planning, that is to say, the practice of partitioning and regulating land for development, has its origins in the 1947 British legislation. It is this legislation that has created the basis for modern town and country planning as it currently practiced in Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed the entire Commonwealth Caribbean. Just 4 years before the passage of the THA Act of 1996, the UK Parliament passed the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990, with significant devolution, making councils of counties and districts in Scotland and Wales, and later on the governments of Scotland and Wales, the approving authorities for planning approval. This act, this 1990 Act of the UK Parliament, however, probably exerted similar influence on our own town and country planning regulations with respect to the Tobago House of Assembly Act of 1996. Whatever the intent, it is our view, Madam Presiding Officer, that the THA Act 40 of 1996 presents for us in this chamber a unique opportunity in law to manage and control the town and country planning responsibility in Tobago. And I speak specifically of the 5th schedule of the THA Act and the attendant sections that give effect to the authority and responsibility of the Tobago House of Assembly. There has been much apprehension and consternation in Trinidad, and indeed, sometimes regrettably, as we heard today in Tobago, around the interpretation of sections 25(1) of the THA Act. I wish to state categorically in this chamber today, Madam Presiding Officer, that we on this side have no such apprehension. On the contrary, we are fully convinced that the Executive Council of the THA has the authority to take control of town and country planning, and that is what we intend to do. I wish to point out that fundamental features of the THA Act are established under Chapter 11A of the Constitution Amendment Act of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. This act gives specific powers and functions to the THA and its Executive Council on matters incidental thereto. The provisions of the THA Act 40 of 96 are limited by Section 4 of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago in 3 fundamental ways. To make it short, I will just focus on one, and I quote, "Laws made by the Tobago House of Assembly have effect only in Tobago and in any part of the territorial sea of Trinidad and Tobago which is within 6 nautical miles of Tobago." Let me read that again. Laws made by the THA have effect only in Tobago and in any part of the territorial sea of Trinidad and Tobago, which is within 6 nautical miles of Tobago. And while the limitation of the 6 nautical miles remain a matter for further discussion, we believe that the Act gives us the right, certainly, to make policy direction as it relates to Tobago. My interpretation of this clause suggests that notwithstanding the provisions of 75(1) of the Constitution, the legislature of the THA has the authority to make laws for all matters outlined in the 5th Schedule of the THA Act for the area defined as Tobago. The corollary of this lawmaking authority, Madam Presiding Officer, is that the Executive Council of the THA has the authority to formulate and implement policies related to those laws for the area defined as Tobago. This authority to formulate and implement policies for Tobago is outlined Section 25(1), famous section of the THA Act of 1996. It is also important for me to point out the distinction between the language of Section 21(1) of Act 37 of 1980 and Section 25(1) of Act 40 of 96. The point I'm trying to make clear here is the distinction between the two clauses. Madam Presiding Officer, according to Section 21(1) of the THA Act 37 of 1980, the THA has the responsibility to formulate and implement policy on matters, quote, referred to it by the minister, unquote. In 1980, from 1980 to 1996, the THA could only implement policy on matters referred to it by the minister or the relevant minister in any area of government. Unlike the THA Act 37 of 1980, the current Act at Section 25 gives the THA authority for the formulation and implementation of policy for all matters outlined in the 5th Schedule. Again, unlike Act 37 of 1980, there is no recourse for the authority of a minister. And therefore, the regulation requiring recommendations of the appeal panel of the Town Country Appeal Panel to be signed off by the minister does not apply and allows us in Tobago to set up our own appeal process. Madam Presiding Officer, further to the responsibilities outlined in the 5th Schedule, the Act goes on to state in Section 27 that where services fall within the responsibility of the Assembly pursuant to Section 25(1), or where the Assembly acts as agent of the government, statutory authority, or state enterprise pursuant to Section 26(2), these services shall be administered by the Assembly. These services, I repeat, shall be administered by the Assembly. Madam Presiding Officer, the member for Darrell Spring Wim ought to know, as do other members in this chamber, that the term shall in Section 27 is an obligatory term, not a discretionary one. Madam Presiding Officer, there are those who would argue that even Section 26(2) provides another avenue through which we can take control of town and country planning. And just the juxtaposition, the Sections 25(1), Sections 25(2), and 27 makes it pellucidly clear that there is no need for the THA to enter into an MOU to take control of town and country planning. Therefore, this House and our side intends to adopt this resolution as proposed without variation, without amendment. Madam Presiding Officer, as I end my presentation, I wish to remind the members of this chamber that land plays an important role in the economic development of countries. There are many theories that connect land inequality with different dimensions of economic development. Efficacious land use, development planning, and land distribution are critical in facilitating societies to transition out of poverty into human capital-based developed economies. Property rights and political economy of urban and regional planning, the zoning of land, and the types of approvals attached to land are seminal to socio-economic development. These remains critical for the THA as we go forward. The effective management of land management system is dependent on the strength of our legislative planning framework and the effective governance arrangements related thereto. Additionally, planning approvals for construction, subdivisions, and land consolidations, change of use, or any or all of the intricacies under the general zoning, layout, site development, and engineering standards which can affect the granting of approvals have significant impact to the socio-economic development of Tobago. The implications that land use has in capital development, capital investment, industrial development, business and enterprise development, employment, wealth creation, wealth distribution, etc., can all be tied to planning approval. Therefore, all of the foregoing can constructively be seen as controlled in large part by whoever controls the granting of planning approvals. The point I am making is that if we do not control the planning approval process and the final planning approval, and we leave it in the hands of someone else, we are constructively giving up the economy of Tobago to somebody else. This is why, Madam Presiding Officer, the motion before this House is so important and critical, and this is why we should all support it. Those on the minority side must, by this point in their development, understand that construction is one of the largest economic drivers in Tobago. It has the greatest coefficient with respect to the multiplier effect that produces trickle-down effect with a positive impact on medium and small businesses and the common man. I been in the construction business for most of my adult life. I know of at least 3 multi-million-dollar projects, several housing projects, innumerable change of use applications that could not gain approval over the last 20 years. Imagine how the GDP generation has been lost to the Tobago economy over those years. This is why the motion before this House is so important and critical, and why we should all support it. The Chief Secretary spoke about what happened with that property at Rocky Point and the intent to build a Marriott. And you know, we in Tobago, we need all the development we could have. But my understanding is the last THA not only sat back and did nothing, you know, they were complicit in how they went about their duties. My information is, Madam Presiding Officer, that the title of those lands at Rocky Point, vested in the THA, were transferred to the central government, that the central government, so-called, then transferred it to ETEC, and then ETEC then leased it to one of you know who. That is kind of an example of how business is done and was done in the past, and how important it is for us to wrest back this responsibility that has been given to us since 1996, and to stop this ability for these kinds of deals to be made between those who control government in Trinidad. Don't talk about the airport. Clearly our responsibility being executed from Trinidad. Just now we would see in Tobago where Pure and the Ministry of Works will come to Tobago and build roads for the airport project. Because unless we take responsibility for all the areas we have, somebody in government in Port of Spain, some misguided Tobagonians who support government from Port of Spain, is going to contrive a way to take back all the responsibilities that we have. And this is why the motion before this House is so important and critical, and why we should all support it. So as I close my presentation, Madam Presiding Officer, I wish to ask very soberly, I wish to ask all of Tobago to, in colloquial terms, cork your ears from all the old talk that's around these days and support your Tobago government. Support us as we attempt to re-engineer this land that is ours. Finally, allow me to take this opportunity to thank my constituents and the good people of Tobago for giving me the opportunity to serve in this august chamber. I want to assure them, through you, Madam Presiding Officer, that I will do all within my power to deliver on the commitments I made during the election campaign. And I can only do this and be thankful for those who supported me. I thank you.